Hello, my name is Gabriel Kuhn. I am originally from Austria. I left the country 25 years ago, traveled a lot, and ended up in Sweden in 2007 and have been living here since. I work as an author and translator and am active in various political projects and organizations. And I will talk about my latest book today, which came out with PM Press earlier this year and is called Liberating Sápmi, Indigenous Resistance in Europe's Far North. I want to thank the organizers of the book fair for inviting me. I'm very impressed that they've been able to pull off an online book fair. I would have never thought that such a thing was possible. So I feel it's quite remarkable, and I'm honored to be a part of it. When I first thought about doing a presentation of this book without an audience and nothing but a microphone in front of me, I thought that 30 minutes would be plenty of time. But then when I started to do a bit of rehearsing, I realized that it's not much time at all, in fact. So unfortunately, I will get to read less from the book than I hope to, because I feel that before I can start reading from it, I have to give listeners at least a somewhat solid background on the book and the history of the Sami people, which maybe not everyone is all that familiar with. And this will take at least 15, perhaps 20 minutes. And I will have to cut many corners. So this will really be a very basic introduction, just to give some background information. And I hope listeners will understand, given the circumstances and time restraints. Before I start with that overview, I want to say something real quick about why I, as a complete outsider, decided to do a book about the Sami people. So the very general background is that I've had a long-standing interest in indigenous peoples and their political struggles. As a very young student in the 1990s, I moved to the US to attend classes in what was to become an American Indian Studies program at Arizona State University. I traveled to Pine Ridge to learn more about the history of the American Indian movement. I later spent time in Australia and New Zealand to learn more about the situation of indigenous peoples there. And I ended up staying in New Caledonia for 6 months when I became very interested in the anti-colonial struggle of the Kanak people there. Now, those experiences have popped up in my work here and there and have influenced me in many ways, but I never thought it was my place to embark on a bigger book project about indigenous peoples, since I felt there were other people who are much more qualified to do that, first and foremost indigenous authors themselves. But when I came to Sweden, and after I had been living here for a few years, I felt that there was an opportunity that I got mainly based on fairly random biographical coincidence to contribute, help spread information about the Sami people to an international audience. And that has to do with the fact that living here and being able to speak and understand Swedish and Norwegian allows me to communicate with the vast majority of Sami people, allows me to have access to a lot of Sami media, which is usually bilingual, so in Sami language and then in one of the colonial languages, mainly Norwegian and Swedish. And at the same time, I have a well-established working relationship with PM Press, a publisher that was interested in bringing out a book that I thought was missing on the English language market, namely a fairly short, easy to read, illustrated, yet affordable introduction into Sami history and the political struggles of the Sami. There are plenty of, I can say that too, I mean, there are plenty of very good English language, there are some very good English language books on the Sami people, but most of them are academic studies. They are not that easy to get. Sometimes they're quite expensive. So I felt that that particular book I had in mind could make a contribution. And then after a fair bit of soul searching and conversations with people from the Sami community, I felt that I could act as a facilitator to build a platform for Sami voices to be heard by a broader international audience. And so the book basically consists of a longer introduction, which makes up about a third of the book, which is called A Short Political History of Sápmi. And then the main part of the book, 2/3, are interviews with 12 prominent Sami artists, activists, and scholars. And in addition to that, there is a resource guide at the end of the book. There are also some documentary texts by and about Sami, and this resource guide with information about other literature, film, music, and online sources for further research. So this is what the book looks like. And now to the basic general background information that I mentioned earlier. So the origins of the Sami people lie in modern-day Russia, from where the ancestors of the Sami started to move westward a few thousand years ago, eventually populating the Kola Peninsula of Russia along the borders to Norway and Finland, and the northernmost parts of modern-day Finland, Sweden, and Norway. And this territory in the Sami language is called Sapmi, roughly the land of the Sami. The Sami were a nomadic people living in small communities of a few extended families. There was never any centralized administration, but the Sami were united by a common language, shared spiritual beliefs and creation myths, cultural traits, music, handicraft, clothing, and livelihoods, mainly hunting, fishing, and eventually reindeer herding. Until the 16th century, the Sami remained relatively independent, especially in the interior of Sápmi. If there was contact with people from southern parts of Scandinavia, it was through trading along the coast. This changed drastically in the 17th century, when a process of colonization began that was very similar to the ones that other indigenous peoples around the world had to experience. As the centralized power of the European nation states grew, Sápmi became increasingly interesting to them, not least because it is very rich in minerals, forest, and waterways. So settlement by non-Sami of Sápmi was encouraged by the nation-state governments in the north of Europe. Mines were established in Sápmi. The Sami were driven from their traditional lands. They were often prohibited from hunting and fishing, and they were used as forced laborers at the mines. They were divided by nation-state borders, which made the reindeer herding very difficult. Also sometimes led to forced migration, where Sami communities had to move up to 1,000 kilometers to other places. So all of this has created big problems that remain to this day. Traditional Sami spirituality was persecuted. During the worst times of Christianization, Sami shamans were burned at the stake. And Overall, the government policies focused on forced assimilation, with then eventually in the 19th century boarding schools where Sami children weren't allowed to use their language, where they sometimes only had the opportunity to visit their families twice a year, and so forth. And by the beginning of the 20th century, the Sami had become minorities almost in all parts of Sápmi, except for areas in the Norwegian province of Finnmark in the very far north. And they were treated as second-class citizens, and they had no particular rights to protect their culture and way of life. Now, in this context, a milestone in the political organization of the Sami was the first Sami National Assembly in Tvante, internationally better known by its Norwegian name Trondheim. In 1917, the assembly was organized by Elsa Laula, an iconic figure in the Sami struggle for self-determination. And that meeting started the process of Sami self-organizing, both in terms of political organizations, Sami media, and other forms of collaboration. But it really took until the 1980s before there were major breakthroughs and public awareness about the Sami situation, and their anti-colonial struggles grew. And this was mainly related to a broad protest movement that emerged opposing the construction of a hydropower plant along the Alta River in the far north of Norway. This protest movement started with local protests, blockades, and the like, but then spread all the way to Oslo, the Norwegian capital, where a Sami camp was erected outside of the parliament building, where hunger strikes were held, and eventually there was also an occupation by Sami women of the Norwegian Prime Minister's office. And these actions and similar actions caused a lot of media attention also internationally, and really changed the course of Sami politics. And since then, there's been some progress, most notably in the form of the Sami parliaments, which today exist both in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, and an increase in cultural recognition and representation of the Sami by the respective nation states, and related to that too, also certain rights in the fields of education and language. However, the Sami still have very little control over their traditional lands. The political powers of the Sami parliaments are very limited, so they cannot influence the decision-making processes of the national parliaments, for example. There's also increasing pressure by multinational corporations that are interested in expanding mining, forestry, and energy industry in Sápmi, and that in order to get the relevant permits they need, have to turn to the nation-state governments and not the Sami people themselves. And there's also ongoing everyday racism and discrimination against the Sami people. So this was a really short overview of the situation that is explored in much more depth in the interviews of the book. And before I start reading from some of them, I just want to add, just for further illustration, a few numbers. So as I mentioned before, the Sami are divided between Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. As none of these countries runs a census that would classify people according to ethnic or cultural affiliation, there are no official figures for how many Sami there are. The numbers that are cited differ greatly because different criteria are used, and self-identification is a decisive factor. But if you look at the numbers provided by Sami organization themselves, we can speak of about 100,000 Sami overall, with about 70,000 of them living in Norway, 20,000 in Sweden, about 8,000 in Finland, and then a couple of thousand in Russia. Now, the Sami community in Russia is not only the smallest, but it is also the one with the most unique recent history, mainly because it was very isolated during the time of the Soviet Union. And today, given the political situation in Russia, it is difficult to discuss politics and in particular political resistance. So while the book includes information about the situation in Russia, none of the 12 people I interviewed comes from what is commonly referred to as the Russian side of Sápmi. It was just not possible for me to organize such an interview. So the 12 people I interviewed come from the Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish sides. And now I think I can move on to read from the interviews. I would love to be able to read from all 12 interviews, but there is no time. All of them are equally important, so I will make a selection that is fairly random here. And most of the quotes will be fairly short too, so this is really just going to be more sound bites that hopefully give a better impression of both the contents but also the tone of the book. So let's see, what have I written down here? I will start with a quote from the very first interview with Synnøve Persson, who is today a very prominent painter and poet, and who was a key figure during the Alta protests I mentioned in the late 1970s and early 1980s. She was part of the first hunger strikers outside of the Parliament of Norway. And she says about that time, the week of the hunger strike in 1979 was one of the weeks when everything changes. Most importantly, it began to dawn on the people of Norway what was actually happening in Sapmi. They didn't know, and the authorities didn't want them to know. Many Norwegians hardly knew that Sami existed outside of museums. They had no concept of us as living people. This was a week of revelation. The protests in Alta gathered people from around the country. The fight for Sami rights was part of it, but the movement was bigger than that. Environmentalists, farmers, salmon fishers. Many were involved. That's what made it so special. There was a strong sense of solidarity. Another person who was involved in those protests was Nilas Zombie, and I did an interview with him as well. Nilas was also involved in 1982 in an attempt to damage a bridge that was leading to the construction site of the Alta Dam. That attempt failed. There was premature detonation that injured Nilas severely. So he was brought to hospital and then arrested and threatened with a long prison sentence. He managed to leave the country, and with the help of an international network of indigenous activists, made his way to Canada, where he hid for a couple of years before returning to Norway when it was clear that the sentence he received would be much less than what he had to fear at first. Nilas is saying about his time in Canada, about his arrival, the following. First, I had to be hidden. I was brought to Brentwood Bay on Vancouver Island. There, I stayed in a longhouse. One man, Philip Paul, became my prime contact. He visited me at the longhouse regularly, trying to understand my story. I had to explain why I was white. I told him about the Alta conflict, and we talked much about spirituality. Philip Paul and I discovered that we had many things in common. We had wonderful conversations, and it became clear to him that I wasn't just some wild man in hiding. A few months later, I was adopted by the New Halt Nation during a ceremony in Williams Lake. After that, I stayed in Bella Coola. Another interview I was able to do was with May-Britt, who is the best known Sami recording artist. And I'm going to read another quote with a relation to Canada, and this time about the opening of the Winter Olympics in Lillehammer, Norway in 1994, because May-Britt was invited to partake in the opening ceremony, and she declined the offer. And here is her explanation. While touring in Canada, I had read about the 1988 Winter Olympics and how Indigenous people didn't want to serve as a decoration for the event. So when the Winter Olympics came to Norway, I thought, okay, now they'll want us as a decoration. It was a very difficult time for me personally, but I knew that if I said yes to the invitation, I had to be strong, because it is always a struggle to get these things right, to make people understand that it needs to be done in a respectful way. I felt I didn't have the energy, and so I said no. I guess I also wanted to send a message to the Norwegian government, making it clear that they didn't respect Sami rights enough. The government was shocked. A minister publicly declared that I was arrogant. My response was clear. If I was a Norwegian minister, I would never dare to use the word arrogant when talking about a Sami. If we move on to contemporary struggles, let me quote a part from the interview with Aslak Holmberg, an activist from the Finnish side of Sápmi. One of the causes he's been involved in much recently concerns new fishing regulations along the Diatno River on the border between Norway and Finland. And what he says about it illustrates also the ongoing problems that exist with rights to self-determination and political control over one's own destiny, despite the existence of the Sami parliaments. So Aslak says, the government recognizes us as Indigenous people, which means that our way of life ought to be protected and that we ought to be involved in making the decisions that affect our way of life. But how that translates into legislation is open to interpretation. For the Finnish government, for example, it is enough to invite us to a hearing and let us voice our concerns. Then the politicians and officials go off and make their own decisions. Obviously, that's not how I interpret it. It's a far cry from anything that could reasonably be seen as respecting the right to self-determination. In the case of the new fishing regulations, all of the Sami who went to the government hearings were against them. It made no difference. Similar thoughts, in this case also in particular on the Sami parliament, has Anders Sunna. Anders is a popular painter from the Swedish side of Sapmi. And he says, so in an interview we're talking about the progress that a lot of people point to in terms of Sami political organization and representation, and that many people speak of a success story over the last 20, 30 years. And Anders says, but that story is not true. Yes, everyone refers to the Sami parliaments and whatnot, but the truth is nothing has changed. The Sami parliaments have no power. In Sweden, the Sami parliament is subordinate to the Ministry for Rural Affairs. Essentially, it has nothing to say. It was set up by the Swedish state and is modeled after colonial political institutions. Being dependent on the Swedish state, Sami politicians always have to be worried about losing funding. As we're approaching the half-hour mark, I'll conclude with one quote that's a little longer, and it's actually the final part of the final interview in the book, in this case with Maxida Merak, also from the Swedish side of Sápmi, a popular artist and actor. And she says about the future of the Sami people and the prospects, political prospects of the community, the following. I think it's beneficial for us that Sweden has become more multicultural. People in Sweden have begun to understand that it's not bizarre or inferior if you live in a different way, speak a different language, or have a different religion. Today, they realize that the world is diverse, and they start to understand how badly the Sami have been treated by the Swedish state. There have been improvements in education, and we have gotten access to institutions we were excluded from before. The problem is that we don't have much time left to turn things around for everyone. Our resources are running out, and it's soon game over. Once you have built too many mines and destroyed the land, there is no way back. This really concerns me. And then there's the question, any chance to still turn things around? And Maxida says, call me naive, but I believe in the good of people. We always assume that people are bad. Why? We all have hearts, and if you touch a person's heart, you can change that person. I believe that humanity will realize how much there is to learn from indigenous peoples. It becomes so obvious that what we have said for centuries is true. If you don't treat nature with respect, it will come back to haunt you. I have to believe that we can still turn things around. Otherwise, I'd have to give up fighting. With that, I'll finish my audio online presentation for this book fair. That was a first for me too, and somewhat odd but interesting experience. Thanks to everyone who's been listening. Thanks again to the organizers. Thanks for the people who are helping with the recording. Stay safe and fight the power. Greetings, Gabriel.